Part 1. The Contract of Ice. I traced the signature on the marriage certificate, acutely aware that the man standing next to me, the most powerful alpha in the city, would rather plunge a knife into his own hand than slip this ring onto my finger. The black ink was barely dry, yet it felt like my fate had been permanently sealed in stone. I am Julian, a 23-year-old Omega who had the absolute misfortune of being born into the sinking ship that was the Hayes family. My parents were notorious high-stakes gamblers and failed investors. When the ruthless debt collectors finally came knocking with threats of ruin, my parents didn't ask for mercy. They sold my marriage contract to the Vance family matriarch to clear a massive corporate debt. And that is how I ended up shackled to Silas Vance, S-rank alpha, billionaire CEO. A man whose reputation for corporate ruthlessness was only eclipsed by his absolute, vocal disdain for Omegas. Standing beside him in the sterile, overly air-conditioned private room of the city hall, I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. Silas hadn't looked at me once. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that hugged his intimidatingly broad shoulders, his jaw clenched tight enough to snap bone. His pheromones, usually a dominant, suffocating blend of crushed cedar and winter frost, were suppressed by medical-grade blockers so heavily that the air around him felt physically cold. "Is it done?" Silas's voice was a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated against the polished marble floors. He didn't ask me. He directed his glare at his grandmother's nervous lawyer. "Yes, Mr. Vance. The marriage is legally binding," the lawyer stammered. "Your grandmother's conditions for the full transfer of the company's shares have been thoroughly met." Silas let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Fantastic. Now get out of my sight." The lawyer scurried away, leaving us alone. For the first time, Silas turned his piercing steel-gray eyes toward me. The hostility in his gaze was so palpable I instinctively took a step back. I was known in high society as a defective Omega. My scent was muted, almost non-existent, and my heats were irregular and weak. I was never meant to be a prize, yet here I was, chained to a man who viewed my entire biological existence as a pathetic inconvenience. "Don't flatter yourself by thinking this little piece of paper means anything," Silas said, his tone dripping with venom. "You are a business transaction, a necessary evil. Nothing more." "I know," I replied quietly, keeping my eyes fixed on his expensive leather shoes. "I don't expect anything from you." He scoffed. "Good. Let's get this circus over with." We walked out to the waiting black limousine in a suffocating silence. The moment the heavy, bulletproof doors closed, Silas reached into the compartment beside him. He pulled out a thick manila folder and tossed it unceremoniously onto my lap. "Read it. Memorize it. Sign the last page," he commanded, pouring himself a glass of scotch. He didn't offer me one. I opened the folder. The header read, "Post-nuptial agreement and rules of cohabitation." "You don't even know me, yet you've prepared a survival manual?" I asked, a spark of irritation finally cutting through my numbness. Silas took a slow sip of his drink. "I know exactly what you are. An Omega, which means you are a biological time bomb of chaotic hormones and endless neediness. I refuse to let my life be derailed by someone else's unpredictable heat cycles." I flipped past the first few pages and skimmed the bullet points. Rule 1. We reside in separate wings of the penthouse. You are not to enter my personal quarters. Rule 2. We will not attend public functions together unless explicitly required. Rule 3. You will manage your own heat cycles with suppressants. Under no circumstances will I provide alpha pheromones. Rule 4. In exactly 1 year, we will file for a quiet, uncontested divorce. I didn't bother reading the rest. I pulled a pen from my jacket pocket and signed my name. I closed the folder and pushed it back. Silas raised an eyebrow. "You didn't even read the financial compensation clause." "I don't care about your money, Silas," I said, leaning my head against the cool glass of the window. "My family's debt is cleared. I'm free from them. You want a ghost for a husband? Congratulations. You've got one." A tense silence settled over the car. I could feel Silas staring at me, searching for the hidden manipulation he was so certain existed. He was an S-rank alpha accustomed to Omegas throwing themselves at his feet. My sheer apathy seemed to confuse him. "We'll see how long this act lasts," he muttered. "When your biology kicks in, you'll be whining at my door just like the rest of them." The limousine descended into the private parking of the Vance Tower. We took the VIP elevator to the top floor. The penthouse was breathtakingly beautiful, but completely devoid of warmth. "Your room is down the East Hall," Silas instructed, not even bothering to take off his coat. "Stay out of my way." He turned and headed down the opposite corridor, his heavy footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. A moment later, I heard the firm slam of his door. I stood alone in the massive living room. My entire life had fit into one small duffel bag. I had traded the toxic environment of my parents' house for a golden cage wrapped in ice. I navigated the silent hallways until I found my room. I dropped my bag and collapsed onto the mattress. The stress of the past few weeks was finally catching up to me. I closed my eyes, but my stomach let out a pathetic grumble. I hadn't eaten anything since yesterday. Sighing, I dragged myself to the kitchen. I opened the massive refrigerator and grabbed some eggs and vegetables. The rhythmic sound of the knife against the wooden cutting board was oddly soothing. For a brief moment, I lost myself in the task, forgetting the miserable reality of my marriage. I was just sliding a simple omelet onto a plate when the kitchen door swung open. Silas froze in the doorway. He had shed his suit jacket and tie, the top buttons of his white shirt undone. He looked exhausted, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I thought you'd be asleep," he said, his voice rough. "I was hungry," I replied neutrally. "I'm leaving now. You can have the space." As I walked past him, the distance between us closed to a few inches. In that split second, the heavy scent blockers he wore seemed to falter. A sudden wave of his natural pheromones, crushed cedar, crisp winter air, and something deeply wild, washed over me. It hit me like a physical blow. As a defective Omega, I rarely reacted to alpha scents. But Silas's pheromones bypassed every defense I possessed. My breath hitched, and my knees trembled. I gripped the edge of my plate, forcing myself to stay upright. I traced the signature on the marriage certificate, acutely aware that the man standing next to me, the most powerful alpha in the city, would rather plunge a knife into his own hand than slip this ring onto my finger. Welcome to your BL boyfriend. If you're ready for a thrilling, high-stakes enemies-to-lovers Omegaverse story full of intense drama, undeniable chemistry, and unexpected twists, you are in the right place. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, smash the like icon, and comment down below what you think will happen next. Your support helps us create more amazing BL stories. Now, take a deep breath, and let's dive into the story. At the same moment, Silas stopped dead. His head snapped toward me, his nostrils flaring. I had never worn scent blockers because I never needed them. My scent was a faint blend of rain-washed stones and white tea. Weak. Defective. But as I stood next to him, Silas's pupils dilated rapidly, swallowing the gray of his irises until his eyes were entirely black. "What?" Silas growled, his voice dropping into a primal alpha timbre that sent a shiver straight to my core. "What is that scent?" "I don't know what you're talking about," I lied, my heart hammering violently. I took a panicked step back. Silas stepped forward, closing the gap instantly. He towered over me, his chest rising and falling heavily. He leaned down, his face hovering millimeters from my neck. I could feel the scorching heat of his breath against my sensitive scent gland. "You smell like..." He trailed off, his jaw clenching hard. He looked furious, confused, and dangerously out of control. The man who hated Omegas was completely captivated by the weakest scent in the world. "Back away, Silas," I warned, my voice shaking. "Rule number 1, remember? We keep our distance." The reminder of his own rules seemed to snap him out of it. The darkness receded from his eyes, replaced by a storm of rage at himself. He abruptly shoved past me. The plate slipped from my hands, shattering on the marble floor. "Clean that up," he snarled viciously over his shoulder. "And don't ever release your pathetic pheromones near me again, or I'll throw you out myself." He stormed out, and a second later, the resounding crash of his bedroom door shaking its frame echoed through the penthouse. I stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the broken porcelain. My hands were trembling. But what scared me far more than his anger was the strange, sudden heat pooling in the pit of my stomach. According to every doctor, my scent glands were underdeveloped. I was practically immune to sudden heat triggers. But the burning sensation spreading through my veins told a terrifyingly different story. Silas Vance hadn't just insulted me. He had accidentally awakened a dormant, desperate part of my Omega nature. The 1-year countdown had only just begun, and I was already terrified that I wouldn't survive it. End of Part 1. Part 2, The Scent of Defiance. I stared blankly at the shattered porcelain scattered across the pristine black marble of the kitchen floor. My reflection was visible in the glossy surface, and even to my own eyes, I looked like a ghost. But I didn't feel like one. For the first time in my 23 years of life, I felt terrifyingly, undeniably alive, and it was tearing me apart from the inside out. My hands were trembling so violently that when I finally knelt to pick up the broken pieces of the plate, A sharp shard sliced right through the pad of my index finger. A bright drop of crimson blood welled up, but I barely registered the pain. It was entirely eclipsed by the suffocating, molten heat radiating from my lower abdomen, spreading through my veins like liquid fire. This wasn't supposed to happen. I was clinically diagnosed as a latent, defective omega. My doctors had assured my disappointed parents that I would likely never experience a full, debilitating heat cycle. Yet, a mere 5 minutes in the unsuppressed presence of Silas Vance, an S-rank alpha, had forcefully rewritten my biology. Rule number 3, I whispered to the empty kitchen, my voice cracking horribly. You will manage your own heat cycles. Under no circumstances will I provide alpha pheromones. I quickly grabbed a paper towel, wrapped it tightly around my bleeding finger, and practically sprinted down the long, echoing hallway toward my designated wing of the penthouse. Every step felt like wading through thick mud. The air conditioning in the apartment was set to a brisk, almost freezing temperature, but I was burning up, sweat already dampening the collar of my shirt. The moment I reached my room, I slammed the heavy oak door shut and locked it, leaning my back against the cool wood. I slid down to the floor, pulling my knees to my chest. I had to ride this out. I had to prove to Silas that I wasn't the pathetic, needy creature he despised. I refused to be a slave to my newly awakened instincts. I dragged myself to the ensuite bathroom and turned the shower on as cold as it would go. I didn't even bother taking off my clothes. I stepped directly under the freezing spray, gasping as the icy water hit my overheated skin. For a few brief minutes, it offered a fleeting illusion of relief. I sat on the wet tiles, shivering uncontrollably, praying that the sudden spike in my temperature was just a bizarre anomaly, a momentary shock to my system. But biology, especially omega biology triggered by a perfectly matched alpha, is rarely so forgiving. By the time the clock on my nightstand struck 3 a.m., the true nightmare had begun. The cold shower had done nothing but make my muscles ache. I was tangled in the expensive silk sheets of the massive king-sized bed, tossing and turning in a state of feverish delirium. My skin felt overly sensitive, every brush of the fabric sending uncomfortable, electric jolts through my nerve endings. And then there was the scent. My normally faint, uninteresting pheromones, the subtle smell of rain-washed stones and white tea, had mutated. It was no longer weak. It was heavy, concentrated, and overwhelmingly sweet, clinging to the air in the room like a thick fog. I buried my face in the pillows, trying to escape my own scent, but it was impossible. My body was screaming, desperately calling out for the one thing I was explicitly forbidden to have, an alpha. Silas. My clouded mind betrayed me, conjuring the memory of his scent. That intoxicating, suffocating blend of crushed cedar and sharp winter frost. I whined pathetically into the empty room, my pride shattering piece by piece as my biology demanded I seek him out, demanding I crawl down the hallway and scratch at his door until he let me in. No, I sobbed, biting down hard on my lower lip until I tasted the metallic tang of blood. I won't give him the satisfaction. I dragged my heavy, aching body off the bed and stumbled toward my small duffel bag. My hands shook as I dug through my sparse belongings, finally finding a small, battered plastic bottle at the bottom. Suppressants. They were generic, over-the-counter pills meant for latent omegas with mild symptoms, and they were at least 6 months expired. But I had no other choice. Without even getting a glass of water, I dry-swallowed 3 of the chalky pills, coughing and gagging as they scraped down my throat. I crawled back into bed, curling into a tight, miserable ball, praying for the chemicals to work. Hours bled into one another. The morning sun eventually pierced through the gap in the heavy blackout curtains, casting a harsh, blinding beam of light across my face. I was half-conscious, drifting in and out of a painful, hazy stupor. The suppressants hadn't worked. In fact, fighting against an S-rank triggered heat with cheap, expired medication seemed to have only made my body rebel harder. The pain in my abdomen was a relentless, throbbing ache. My scent gland, located at the nape of my neck, felt swollen and hypersensitive, practically pulsating with every frantic beat of my heart. The room was saturated with the heavy aroma of petrichor and tea, so thick you could almost taste it. Suddenly, a sharp, authoritative knock shattered the agonizing silence of the morning. I flinched, my eyes flying open. Julian. Silas's voice bled through the thick wood of the door. It wasn't loud, but the deep, rumbling baritone carried an undeniable, terrifying edge of alpha command. I held my breath, terrified that even the slightest sound would betray how much pain I was in. I clamped my hands over my mouth, tears of sheer exhaustion and biological frustration burning in the corners of my eyes. Go away, I begged silently. Please, just go away and leave me alone. I know you're in there, Julian, Silas said, his voice dropping dangerously low. And I know what you're doing. Open this door immediately. He thought I was doing this on purpose. He thought I was actively trying to seduce him, to trap him, just like he had accused me of in the limousine. The sheer injustice of his assumption sparked a tiny, desperate flame of anger in my chest, cutting through the haze of the heat. I'm fine. I managed to croak out, my voice sounding incredibly weak and raspy, barely recognizable as my own. Go to work, Silas. Follow your own rules. There was a heavy, suffocating pause. I could hear him shifting his weight on the other side of the door. You are flooding the entire penthouse with your pheromones, Silas growled, the anger in his voice vibrating against the walls. It's seeping through the ventilation system. Did you really think you could bypass the agreement by stinking up my home so badly that I'd be forced to come to you? I didn't. I gasped, another intense wave of heat washing over me, forcing my eyes shut. I didn't do it on purpose. Just give me a few hours. I took medication. You are a terrible liar, Silas snapped. Before I could even process his words, there was a sharp electronic beep. The heavy locking mechanism of the door clicked open. My blood ran cold. Of course he had the master code to every room in his own penthouse. The illusion of my privacy, of my safety, evaporated in an instant. The door swung inward, hitting the wall with a resounding thud. Silas stood in the doorway, fully dressed in another impeccable, intimidating suit, looking like an untouchable god of the corporate world. But the moment he crossed the threshold, his entire demeanor fractured. The wall of my concentrated scent hit him with the force of a physical blow. Silas stopped dead in his tracks, his broad chest heaving as he instinctively inhaled a sharp, deep breath. His hands, which had been clenched in furious fists at his sides, suddenly went slack. From my position tangled in the ruined, sweat-soaked sheets, I watched in absolute terror as the composed, ruthless billionaire unraveled before my eyes. Silas's head tilted back slightly, his eyes fluttering shut for a fraction of a second as his alpha instincts collided violently with his ironclad willpower. The medical-grade scent blockers he wore were entirely useless against the sheer potency of an Omega in distress right in front of him. When he opened his eyes again, the steely, calculating gray was gone. They were pitch black, dilated and wild, completely consumed by the primal, dominant nature he fought so hard to suppress. Julian, he breathed out, the name sounding less like an accusation and more like a desperate, starved prayer. The anger was gone. The disgust was gone. In their place was something infinitely more dangerous: hunger. Silas took a slow, deliberate step into the room, and the heavy, intoxicating scent of crushed cedar and winter frost flooded my senses, instantly overriding my agonizing pain with an overwhelming, terrifying euphoria. Rule number 3 was about to be broken, and deep down, in the most shameful, instinctual part of my soul, I was terrified that I wanted him to shatter it completely. End of part 2. Part 3. The ice melts. Silas took another agonizingly slow step into my room. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, sealing us inside a pressure cooker of violently clashing pheromones. The air was so thick it was practically hard to breathe. My soft scent of rain-washed stones and white tea was completely enveloped by his overpowering aura of crushed cedar and sharp winter frost. Every instinct in my Omega biology screamed at me to submit, to bare my neck and let the S-rank alpha take away the excruciating pain radiating from my core. But my pride, the only thing I had left in this miserable, transactional marriage, refused to yield. "Get out!" I gasped, the words tearing at my dry throat. I practically scrambled backward on the mattress, tangling myself further in the sweat-soaked silk sheets. "You broke your own rule, Silas. Get out of my room." Silas didn't listen. It was as if he couldn't hear me at all. His pitch-black eyes were locked onto my flushed face, tracing the beads of sweat rolling down my temples and the frantic pulse beating visibly at the base of my throat. The pristine, untouchable billionaire CEO was gone. In his place was a creature of pure, unadulterated instinct, fighting a losing battle against his own biology. He reached the edge of the bed. The sheer size of him cast a dark, imposing shadow over me. I shrank back until my shoulders hit the cold mahogany headboard. I had nowhere left to run. "What did you take?" Silas demanded, his voice no longer a civilized baritone but a dangerous, feral rumble that vibrated through the mattress. "Nothing," I lied, my teeth chattering despite the molten heat roasting me from the inside out. "I told you. I can manage it. Just leave." Silas's jaw clenched so hard a muscle feathered frantically in his cheek. He reached out, his large hand moving with terrifying speed. Before I could flinch away, his long fingers wrapped around my wrist. The moment his skin made contact with mine, a violently bright spark of electricity shot up my arm. I let out a pathetic, involuntary whimper as a wave of sheer, unadulterated relief washed over the agonizing ache in my lower abdomen. The physical contact was like throwing ice water onto a raging inferno. It felt so incredibly good that it terrified me. But Silas didn't pull me closer. Instead, he hissed through his teeth and immediately let go of my wrist, looking at his own hand in sheer shock. "You're burning," he breathed, the predatory haze in his eyes fracturing to reveal genuine, human panic. He looked back at me, finally registering the unnatural pallor of my skin beneath the feverish flush. "Your temperature is lethally high. This isn't a normal heat, Julian. What the hell did you take?" My vision was starting to blur at the edges, dark spots dancing across my eyes. "Suppressants," I mumbled, my head lolling against the headboard as my strength finally evaporated. I took my suppressants. From my bag. Silas didn't hesitate. He turned sharply, his keen eyes scanning the room until he spotted my small duffel bag on the floor. He strode over, crouching down to retrieve the battered plastic bottle I had left sitting next to it. He examined the label, and I heard him let out a string of vicious, colorful curses that seemed entirely out of place for a man of his refined status. "These are generic grade," Silas snarled, marching back to the bed. "And they expired 8 months ago. Are you insane? Do you have a death wish?" They used to work," I whispered defensively, tears of pain and sheer humiliation finally spilling over my eyelashes. "I'm defective. I don't get strong heats." "I didn't know." "You didn't know that putting an unbonded Omega in the same enclosed environment as a suppressed S-rank Alpha would force an extreme biological reaction," Silas shouted, though the anger in his voice sounded more like desperation now. "The moment my blockers slipped in the kitchen yesterday, your body perceived it as a mating call. You are experiencing a high-grade chemically induced fever because your body is violently rejecting those expired pills while simultaneously trying to prepare for an alpha." I closed my eyes, a strangled sob escaping my throat. The pain was intensifying again, doubling in strength now that he was no longer touching me. It felt like my very bones were melting. I curled into a tight, miserable ball, gripping the sheets until my knuckles turned stark white. "Please," the word slipped out before I could stop it. "The ultimate surrender. Please, it hurts. Make it stop." Silence fell over the room, broken only by the ragged, desperate sound of my own breathing. I expected him to mock me. I expected him to remind me of the contract, to throw my vulnerability in my face, and walk away to let me suffer the consequences of my own biology. Instead, the mattress dipped under a heavy weight. Suddenly, I was being moved. Strong, capable arms slid under my knees and my back, lifting me effortlessly from the damp, ruined sheets. I gasped as I was pulled flush against a broad, solid chest. Silas had climbed onto the bed, pulling me securely into his lap. "Stop fighting it," Silas ordered, his voice remarkably gentle, a stark contrast to his usual ruthless demeanor. "Stop fighting me, Julian." He didn't do anything inappropriate. He didn't take advantage of my helpless state. Instead, Silas did the one thing he had sworn in a legal document he would never do. He stopped fighting his own alpha nature. He buried his face into the crook of my neck, right over my hypersensitive scent gland, and purposefully released a massive, controlled wave of his unsuppressed pheromones. The impact was instantaneous and astronomical. The thick, suffocating smell of crushed cedar and sharp winter frost flooded my lungs, wrapping around my senses like a heavy, protective blanket. It didn't just mask my pain, it completely eradicated it. The icy, calming nature of his scent rushed through my bloodstream, rapidly cooling my dangerous fever and soothing the frantic, erratic beating of my heart. I melted against him completely, my muscles losing all their rigid tension. Without thinking, I buried my face into his pristine white shirt, inhaling deeply, desperately drinking in the scent that my body had been begging for. My hands weakly grasped the lapels of his suit jacket, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing left in the universe. "Breathe," Silas murmured against my skin, his large hand slowly, methodically stroking up and down my spine. The gesture was so incredibly intimate, so deeply comforting, that it shattered the last remaining wall around my heart. "Just breathe, Julian. I've got you." The ruthless billionaire, the man who despised Omegas, was holding me like I was something precious. The profound confusion of the situation was entirely overshadowed by the sheer exhaustion crashing over me. Protected by his scent and the warmth of his body, the agonizing heat finally shifted from a lethal fever into a deep, heavy state of rest. The darkness pulled me under, and for the first time in my life, I didn't fight it. When I finally opened my eyes again, the world was quiet. There was no pain, no burning fever, just a lingering, dull ache in my muscles and an overwhelming sense of lethargy. I blinked slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the dim lighting of the room. It took me a few seconds to realize I wasn't in my assigned bedroom anymore. The walls were painted a deep, moody charcoal. The bed I was lying in was massive, easily twice the size of mine, with sheets made of dark, heavy velvet rather than white silk. The entire room smelled deeply and permanently of cedar and winter frost. Rule number 1. You are not to enter my personal quarters under any circumstances. I was in Silas's bed. Panic flared in my chest for a brief second, but I quickly realized I was wearing different clothes. My sweat-soaked clothes had been replaced by an oversized, impossibly soft black t-shirt that clearly belonged to Silas. I was tucked neatly under a heavy duvet, and there was an 4-line taped securely to the back of my hand, connected to a bag of clear fluid hanging from a medical stand next to the bed. You've been unconscious for 18 hours. I flinched, turning my head toward the sound of the voice. Silas was sitting in a dark leather armchair in the corner of the room. He looked terrible. His suit was gone, replaced by a pair of casual gray sweatpants and a simple black long-sleeve shirt. His hair, usually styled to absolute perfection, was messy and unkempt, as if he had been running his hands through it for hours. Dark circles bruised the skin under his steely gray eyes. 18 hours? I rasped, my voice sounding incredibly weak. Silas stood up, grabbing a glass of water from a nearby tray. He walked over to the bed and held it out to me. When my trembling hand failed to grasp it properly, he didn't sigh in annoyance. Instead, he gently supported the back of my head with his free hand and held the glass to my lips, helping me drink. The private doctor left a few hours ago, Silas explained, his voice low and devoid of its usual sharp edge. He said the combination of the expired suppressants and the stress of a sudden S-rank trigger almost sent your body into a fatal biological shutdown. If I hadn't intervened when I did, your organs would have started failing. I stared at him, the gravity of his words settling heavily in my chest. I had almost died because of a stupid, expired pill. But more importantly, I had survived because the alpha who hated me had saved me. Why am I in your room? I asked quietly, pulling the duvet up to my chin, suddenly feeling incredibly exposed. Silas looked away, staring at the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the glittering city skyline. For the first time since I met him, the indomitable Silas Vance looked unsure of himself. Your room was entirely saturated with distress pheromones, he said, his tone carefully neutral, though I could hear the slight strain beneath it. The doctor said you needed to be in an environment saturated with calming alpha pheromones to stabilize your nervous system. This was the most logical option. Logic, I repeated, a bitter, hollow laugh escaping my lips. Right. So, you broke your own rules for the sake of logic. Not because you actually care. Silas snapped his gaze back to me, a flash of defensive anger finally returning to his eyes. Don't push it, Julian. I saved your life to avoid a PR nightmare. A dead husband on the second day of our marriage wouldn't exactly look great for the Vance family image. It was a cruel thing to say, but the slight tremor in his voice completely ruined the delivery. He was lying. We both knew he was lying. A man acting purely on PR logistics wouldn't have looked at me with such raw, unhinged desperation when he held me. He wouldn't look so exhausted from sitting in a chair watching me sleep for 18 hours. I see, I said softly, deciding not to challenge him. The fight had drained completely out of me. Thank you for the medical attention. A heavy, complicated silence stretched between us. The dynamic had irrevocably shifted. The contract in the manila folder felt like a distant, naive joke now. We had crossed a boundary that couldn't be uncrossed. My scent was practically branded onto his clothes, and his scent was literally woven into my nervous system. Silas walked back to the armchair and heavily sat down, resting his elbows on his knees and burying his face in his hands. Your heat is over, he finally said, his voice muffled by his palms. The doctor administered a professional, medical-grade neutralizing shot. You're safe now. He lifted his head, his piercing gray eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my breath hitch. But we have a very serious problem, Julian, Silas continued, the dangerous, calculating CEO slowly returning to the surface. The doctor ran a full blood panel while you were unconscious. to ensure the expired pills hadn't caused any permanent liver damage. My stomach dropped. And Silas leaned back in the chair, crossing his arms over his broad chest. The atmosphere in the room shifted from protective to terrifyingly cold in the blink of an eye. "You aren't a defective Omega," Silas stated, his voice laced with a mixture of disbelief and quiet fury. "Your scent and your heats weren't weak because you were biologically flawed. They were weak because you've been chemically poisoned." I froze, the blood draining from my face. "What are you talking about?" "According to the toxicology report," Silas said, his eyes narrowing to dangerous slits, "someone has been slowly microdosing you with a highly illegal black market hormone inhibitor since you were a young teenager. Someone purposely stunted your presentation." The room started to spin. My parents, the failed investors, the people who saw me as nothing more than a bargaining chip. Silas stood up, stalking toward the bed like a predator cornering its prey. "And now that the inhibitor has been flushed from your system by the fever, you are presenting as a prime Omega, the rarest, most sought-after dynamic in the world. Which means, my dear husband, that our little one-year arrangement just became incredibly complicated." End of Part 3. Part 4. The Poisoned Pawn. A prime Omega. The words fell from my lips, but they sounded like they belonged to a stranger. I stared at Silas, the sterile silence of his dark, imposing bedroom pressing against my eardrums. My mind was desperately trying to process the sheer magnitude of what he had just said, but my brain felt like it was submerged in thick molasses. "That's impossible," I whispered, my voice trembling as I shook my head in frantic denial. "Prime Omegas are myths. They're one in a million. They have golden irises, and their pheromones can bring an entire room of alphas to their knees. I'm just Julian. I'm defective." Silas didn't move from his spot, his broad shoulders tense, his jaw locked in a hard line. He looked at me not with the disgust I was so used to, but with a dark, smoldering fury that made my breath catch. "You aren't defective, Julian. You were suppressed. Mutilated from the inside out," Silas corrected, his baritone voice deadly calm, though the storm raging in his pitch-black eyes told a different story. "The doctor found traces of Lumina, 9 in your blood. It's a highly illegal, synthetic neuroinhibitor. It binds to the scent glands and the pituitary gland, artificially freezing an Omega's presentation. It's a chemical cage." I felt the blood drain entirely from my face, leaving my skin ice-cold. My hands, still bearing the taped 4-line, began to shake violently against the dark velvet duvet. "Lumina 9, I repeated, the name tasting like ash on my tongue. "But how? Who would?" My voice trailed off as a horrifying, suffocating memory surfaced from the depths of my childhood. I was 13 years old, the age when most Omegas experience their first preliminary heat. I had started running a slight fever, my scent gland aching. My mother had come into my room, looking not concerned, but absolutely terrified. She had handed me a cup of dark, bitter-tasting tea. "Drink this, Julian. Every last drop. It will keep you safe. You have to drink it every morning, or the monsters will take you away." For 10 years, I had drank that bitter tea. Every single morning. Even on the day of my wedding, my mother had forced a thermos of it into my hands before shoving me into the limousine with Silas. "My parents," I choked out, the realization hitting me with the force of a freight train. A physical wave of nausea rolled through my stomach. I clutched my chest, struggling to pull air into my suddenly restricted lungs. They gave me a special herbal tea. Every day. They said it was for my weak constitution. A low, vibrating growl ripped through Silas's chest. It was a terrifying, primal sound of an S-rank alpha reacting to a direct threat against something that belonged to him. "Why?" I sobbed, the tears I had been fighting finally spilling over my lashes, hot and fast. Why would they do that to their own son? Prime Omegas are revered. They are protected by the state. Why would they hide it? Why would they poison me? Silas took a few measured steps toward the bed, the heavy scent of crushed cedar and winter frost flaring in the room, instinctively wrapping around me to calm my escalating distress. "Because if you presented as a prime Omega, you would have been entered into the National Registry," Silas explained, his voice turning cold and clinical as he broke down the ruthless logic of my parents' betrayal. "By law, prime Omegas are wards of the state until they are appropriately matched with an S-rank alpha of high political or social standing. Your parents wouldn't have been able to use you." I stared at him, my heart breaking into a million irreparable pieces. "Use me. Your parents are degenerate gamblers, Julian. They owed hundreds of millions to dangerous underground syndicates, not just banks," Silas said ruthlessly, sparing me no harsh truths. If the state took you, your parents would get a modest stipend, but they would lose their most valuable asset. By keeping you stunted and hiding your true dynamic, they retained ownership of you. They kept you as their personal get-out-of-jail-free card. And when the debt collectors finally put a gun to your father's head, they sold you to my grandmother. The absolute depravity of it all washed over me. I wasn't a son. I wasn't even a human being to them. I was a casino chip, a piece of property they chemically paralyzed just so they could cash it in at the right moment. A strangled, agonizing cry tore from my throat. I doubled over, burying my face in my knees as I completely shattered. The pain of the expired suppressants and the forced heat was absolutely nothing compared to the agony of this betrayal. I wept for the terrified 13-year-old boy who had trusted his mother. I wept for the decade of my life stolen by poison. Suddenly, the mattress dipped. Before I could retreat into my own misery, large, warm hands gripped my shoulders and forcefully pulled me upward. Silas wrapped his massive arms around me, pulling my trembling body flush against his broad chest. He didn't say a word of comfort. He wasn't built for soft reassurances. Instead, he offered me the ultimate grounding force of his presence. He buried his face in my hair, his heavy, soothing pheromones blanketing me, commanding my erratic nervous system to stabilize. "Cry," Silas ordered gruffly against my ear, his grip tightening around me. "Shatter if you have to. But when you are done, you are going to dry your tears, and you are going to watch me burn the Hayes family to the ground." I froze in his arms, my breath hitching mid-sob. I slowly pulled my head back to look at him. His steely gray eyes were practically glowing with a lethal, calculating violence. "What are you going to do?" I asked, my voice a broken whisper. Silas reached into the pocket of his sweatpants and pulled out his sleek black smartphone. He didn't break eye contact with me as he dialed a single number and put the phone to his ear. "Marcus," Silas said, his voice dropping into the terrifying, ruthless cadence of the billionaire CEO who conquered empires for breakfast. "I want you to initiate Protocol Zero on the Hayes family." There was a pause as the person on the other end spoke, but Silas cut them off effortlessly. "I don't care about the collateral damage," Silas snarled, his eyes locked onto mine, making sure I heard every word. "I want every asset frozen. I want every outstanding gambling debt they have leaked to the syndicates immediately. I want their offshore accounts drained. Buy out the mortgages on their estates and evict them by nightfall. I want them ruined, Marcus. I want them begging for scraps in the gutter by tomorrow morning. Do it." He hung up the phone and tossed it onto the nightstand. I stared at him, completely awestruck and slightly terrified. In less than 60 seconds, Silas Vance had completely obliterated the people who had tortured me for 10 years. "They sold you to me," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, possessive rumble. He reached up, his long thumb gently wiping a stray tear from my cheek. The contact sent a jolt of electricity straight to my newly awakened core. "They made you my responsibility. They signed a contract handing you over to the most ruthless alpha in the city, and they were stupid enough to hand me damaged goods. Nobody touches what belongs to me, Julian. Nobody." The words "what belongs to me" echoed in my mind. A day ago, I would have fought him on that. I would have spat in his face and reminded him I wasn't property. But sitting in his bed, wrapped in his scent, having just watched him avenge 10 years of my trauma in a single phone call, the rebellion died in my throat. "Silas," I started, my voice trembling for an entirely different reason now. "The contract, the post-nuptial agreement." Silas's expression darkened. "What about it?" "Rule 4, I reminded him, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. "In exactly 365 days, we file for a quiet, uncontested divorce. You said you wanted a ghost for a husband. You said you didn't want your life derailed by my biology." Silas looked at me for a long, heavy moment. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. He slowly let go of my shoulders, creating a few inches of distance between us, though his intoxicating scent still enveloped me completely. "That contract was drafted under the assumption that you were a latent, defective omega who could manage his own weak heat cycles," Silas said, his tone shifting into something dangerously absolute. "The reality has changed. The inhibitor is out of your system, Julian. Your true biology is waking up. Within the next few weeks, your scent is going to mature. It's going to become potent enough to drive any alpha within a 1-mile radius completely insane." He leaned in closer, his steely eyes pinning me in place. "A prime omega cannot survive without a bonded alpha," Silas stated, spelling out the terrifying truth of my new existence. "Your heats will be agonizing. They will require physical, chemical, and biological grounding that only an S rank can provide. If you walk out of this penthouse in a year, unbonded and unprotected, you will be hunted down by the registry, or worse, taken by someone who will treat you far worse than your parents did. My breath hitched. Are you saying? I am saying, Silas interrupted, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a shiver straight down my spine, that the divorce is permanently off the table. I stared at him, my mind short-circuiting. But you hate Omegas. I hate manipulative, needy creatures who try to use their biology to extract my wealth, Silas corrected, his gaze dropping briefly to my lips before snapping back up to my eyes. You signed away your alimony. You tried to fight a fatal fever in silence just to avoid asking me for help. You are many things, Julian, but you are not what I expected. He stood up from the bed, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the room. The rules have changed, Silas announced, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt as the ruthless CEO completely took over again. You are no longer confined to the East Wing. You have full clearance to the entire penthouse. You will no longer take suppressants of any kind. I will personally handle your heat cycles from now on. My cheeks flushed crimson at the blunt declaration, a sudden, heavy warmth pooling low in my stomach at the thought of Silas handling my heats. And most importantly, Silas finished, turning back to look at me, his eyes burning with an intense, possessive fire. Tomorrow night, there is a charity gala hosted by the mayor. You are going to put on a bespoke suit, you are going to wear my ring, and we are going to walk the red carpet together. The entire city needs to know exactly who you belong to before your prime scent fully blooms. He didn't wait for my answer. He turned and walked toward the heavy oak door. Rest, he commanded softly before stepping out into the hallway. I'll have the chef bring you something to eat. You're going to need your strength. The door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the massive dark bedroom. The 4-line pulsed quietly in my hand. My entire world had been turned upside down in the span of 24 hours. I had lost my family, discovered my true identity, and somehow, completely by accident, I had awoken the protective, possessive instincts of the most dangerous alpha in the city. The golden cage hadn't been unlocked. The bars had just been reinforced with titanium. But as I buried my face back into the pillow that smelled entirely of Silas Vance, I realized the most terrifying truth of all. I didn't want to leave. End of Part 4. Part 5, The Mark of the Alpha. The next 24 hours were a blur of meticulous, high-stakes preparation. True to his word, Silas had completely taken over the management of my recovery. I was not allowed to leave his massive charcoal-painted bedroom. The private chef delivered trays of nutrient-dense meals every few hours, and a specialized physician came to draw blood, confirming that the last agonizing traces of Lumina-9 had finally been purged from my system. With the poison gone, my body was undergoing a terrifyingly rapid transformation. My scent, once a pathetic, watery whisper, was blooming into a dense, intoxicating cloud of night jasmine and honeyed petrichor. Even breathing it in myself made my head spin. I was a prime. The realization still felt like a heavy, unbelievable dream. By the time the sun dipped below the city skyline on the evening of the mayor's charity gala, I was a nervous wreck. Mr. Vance's styling team is here, sir. A polite voice echoed from the doorway. For the next 2 hours, I was subjected to the ruthless efficiency of elite stylists. They didn't speak to me, their eyes respectfully averted, but I could see the way their hands trembled slightly when they adjusted my collar. Even the beta makeup artists were deeply affected by the raw, sweet potency of my unsuppressed prime scent. When they finally stepped back to let me look in the floor-to-ceiling mirror, a gasp caught in my throat. The pale, exhausted, defective boy who had signed a marriage contract in a cheap jacket was gone. Staring back at me was a breathtaking stranger. I was draped in a bespoke, midnight blue silk suit that hugged my waist and accentuated the subtle, elegant lines of my body. A delicate silver chain rested against my collarbone, catching the light. But the most striking detail was the way I held myself. There was a new, undeniable flush of life in my cheeks, a spark of defiance in my eyes. I didn't look like a victim anymore. The heavy bedroom door clicked shut. The stylist practically vanished into thin air, leaving me entirely alone. Through the reflection of the mirror, I watched Silas step into the room. He wore an immaculately tailored black tuxedo that made his broad shoulders look impossibly wide. His hair was slicked back, his sharp jawline perfectly defined. He looked like a lethal, untouchable king of the underworld. Silas stopped a few feet behind me, his pitch-black eyes sweeping over my reflection. He took in the midnight blue silk, the silver chain, and the heavy platinum wedding band shining on my left hand. You look. Silas started, his deep baritone catching in his throat. His jaw clenched as a muscle feathered in his cheek. He took a slow step closer, his heavy gaze burning a hole right through me. You look exactly like what you are. Mine. He closed the remaining distance, stepping right behind me. I inhaled sharply as his solid chest brushed lightly against my back. The overpowering scent of crushed cedar and sharp winter frost completely enveloped me, and my newly awakened prime biology let out a deep, instinctual purr of absolute satisfaction. My scent is too strong, Silas, I whispered, my voice trembling slightly as I looked at our reflection. If we walk into that ballroom, every alpha in the city will know I'm a prime. They'll know I'm vulnerable. Shouldn't I take a blocker? No, Silas growled, the word tearing out of his throat with visceral, primal rejection. You will never suppress yourself again, Julian. I am not going to hide you in the shadows. He reached out, his large, calloused hands gently gripping my shoulders. He slowly slid his palms down my arms, capturing my wrists. His thumbs pressed firmly against the sensitive pulse points where my minor scent glands lay. I am going to make sure every single person in that room knows exactly whose territory they are stepping into, Silas murmured, his voice dropping into a dangerously possessive register. Before I could even process his words, Silas turned my wrists inward and pressed his own wrists firmly against mine. He began to rub the skin together in a slow, deliberate friction, forcefully transferring his heavy, concentrated alpha pheromones directly onto my glands. The contact sent a blinding jolt of pure electricity straight to my core. I gasped, my knees instantly buckling. If Silas hadn't been holding me flush against his body, I would have collapsed to the floor. This was scent marking. It was an intensely intimate, highly possessive act usually reserved for deeply bonded mates behind closed doors. It was an alpha's way of publicly claiming an omega, wrapping them in a biological armor that screamed a lethal warning to anyone who dared to come close. Silas didn't stop there. He released my hands and gently turned me around to face him. His eyes were entirely blown out, consumed by his protective instincts. He leaned down, burying his face into the crook of my neck. I felt the slight scrape of his jaw against my sensitive skin, followed by the firm, deliberate pressure of his nose tracing my primary scent gland. He inhaled my sweet jasmine scent deeply, making a low, satisfied sound in the back of his throat, before breathing out his heavy winter frost directly onto my pulse point. I gripped the lapels of his tuxedo, my chest heaving, my head falling back to give him better access. By the time he finally pulled away, my own scent was completely buried beneath a suffocating, intoxicating layer of his. I smelled like I had been thoroughly and utterly claimed by Silas Vance. Let them look at you, Silas whispered fiercely, his thumb tracing my lower lip. Let them desire you. But if a single one of them tries to touch you, I will break them. The arrival at the mayor's charity gala was a baptism by fire. As our black limousine pulled up to the red carpet, the chaotic roar of paparazzi and flashing cameras erupted. Just last week, the media had mocked our wedding. They had called me the defective Hayes boy, a pathetic charity case. But as the heavy door opened, the narrative instantly shattered. Silas didn't walk ahead of me. He stepped out right behind me, his large hand instantly finding the small of my back, resting there with a heavy, undeniable claim. He pulled me flush against his side, presenting a united, impenetrable front. The reporters shouted questions, but the moment the evening breeze carried our combined scent over the velvet ropes, a stunned, heavy silence rippled through the entire crowd. Even through the cameras, the alphas could smell it. The incredibly rare, mouth-watering sweetness of a prime omega, violently wrapped in the terrifying, lethal warning of Silas Vance's winter frost. Silas guided me up the grand steps, completely ignoring the stunned whispers breaking out behind us. Inside the lavishly decorated ballroom, the atmosphere was thick with old money and complex political games. The moment we entered, conversations died. I could feel hundreds of eyes raking over me, dissecting my suit, the diamond ring on my finger, and the possessive hand Silas kept firmly anchored to my waist. "Keep your head up," Silas ordered quietly near my ear. "You have nothing to be ashamed of." We hadn't been standing near the Champagne Tower for more than 20 minutes when the inevitable happened. Well, if it isn't the Vance Empire's newest acquisition, a slick, arrogant voice sneered from behind us. We turned to see Damien Croft, the heir to a rival tech conglomerate and an alpha known for his ruthless, playboy reputation. Damien's eyes swept over me, lingering far too long on my waist. "I heard the Hayes family went bankrupt overnight," Damien continued, taking a step closer, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "It's a shame. I was actually considering buying their little defective toy myself. Could have used a quiet, obedient pet." A spike of pure, unadulterated terror pierced my chest. The reminder of my parents' plans made my breath hitch. Damien took another step forward, violating our personal space. He tilted his head, his nostrils flaring as he tried to catch my scent beneath Silas's heavy mark. "Wait a minute," Damien murmured, his smirk faltering as his eyes widened in sheer shock. "That smell, you're a prime?" The greed that instantly flooded Damien's eyes was the most disgusting thing I had ever seen. He instinctively reached his hand out toward my arm. He didn't even get within a foot of me. In a fraction of a second, Silas moved. He didn't shout. He didn't throw a punch. He simply unleashed the full, terrifying, unsuppressed weight of his S-rank alpha aura directly onto Damien. The impact was invisible, but devastating. The air pressure in our immediate vicinity dropped so rapidly it made my ears pop. A suffocating, violently oppressive wave of crushing cedar and freezing frost slammed into Damien like a freight train. Damien gasped, all the color draining from his face. His knees physically buckled under the sheer, dominant pressure of Silas's aura, forcing him to heavily stumble backward. His beta bodyguards immediately backed away, too terrified to intervene. "You have exactly 3 seconds to remove yourself from my sight, Croft," Silas said. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried a lethal, venomous promise that echoed over the quiet music of the ballroom. "If you ever look at my husband like that again, I will personally ensure your entire bloodline is erased from the corporate registry by sunrise." Damien couldn't speak. He was practically choking on Silas's dominant pheromones. He nodded frantically, a pathetic, submissive gesture, before turning and practically sprinting away into the crowd. The entire ballroom had witnessed the brutal display of dominance. The message was received loud and clear by every single person in the room. The defective, Hazeboy, was gone. In his place stood Julian Vance, a prime omega, fiercely protected by a billionaire who would gladly burn the world down to keep him safe. Silas slowly reeled his oppressive aura back in, his hand returning to the small of my back. He looked down at me, his eyes searching my face for any signs of fear. But I wasn't afraid. As I looked up into the steely gray eyes of the man who had been forced to marry me, the man who had saved my life and destroyed my abusers, the last remaining wall around my heart crumbled into dust. My prime biology hummed, my scent subtly sweetening in a completely natural, instinctual response to my protector. I didn't just want to survive this marriage anymore. God help me, I wanted to be his. End of Part 5. Part 6, The Instinct to Nest. The ride back to the penthouse was wrapped in a heavy, electrically charged silence. The chaotic energy of the gala, the flashing cameras, and the sheer terror of Damien Croft's approach felt like a distant fever dream. The only reality that mattered now was the solid, radiating heat of Silas sitting right next to me in the dimly lit, soundproof cabin of the limousine. He hadn't let go of my hand since we left the ballroom. His long, calloused fingers were perfectly intertwined with mine, his thumb drawing slow, rhythmic circles against my knuckles. It was a simple, grounding gesture, yet it sent constant, thrilling electrical shocks straight to my newly awakened core. I looked out the tinted window, watching the blur of the city lights, but my mind was entirely focused on the man beside me. I had spent the last week believing Silas Vance was a heartless, ruthless monster who viewed me as nothing more than an inconvenient business transaction. But tonight, he had wrapped me in his scent, shielded me from the world, and nearly destroyed a man just for looking at me with the wrong intentions. "You're exceptionally quiet," Silas's deep baritone broke the silence, vibrating smoothly in the enclosed space. I turned my head to look at him. He had loosened his bow tie and unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of his crisp white shirt, discarding his tuxedo jacket onto the opposite seat. He looked slightly exhausted, the adrenaline of the public confrontation fading, but his steely gray eyes were sharp and entirely focused on me. "I'm just processing," I admitted softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Everything changed so fast. My parents, the poison, the gala. It feels like I've lived a decade in the last 48 hours. Silas's expression softened, a rare, incredibly handsome sight that made my heart skip a frantic beat. He lifted our joined hands, gently pressing his lips against my knuckles. The touch was so reverent, so deeply affectionate, that my breath hitched in my throat. "You did exceptionally well tonight, Julian," Silas praised, his voice dropping into a low, rumbling timbre that made my prime biology purr in absolute satisfaction. "You didn't flinch. You stood your ground. You are much stronger than you give yourself credit for." I was terrified, I confessed, my cheeks flushing at his compliment as I looked down at my lap. When Damien approached, I thought about my parents. I thought about how easily they would have sold me to someone exactly like him. Damien Croft is a coward, Silas interrupted, his jaw instantly clenching at the mention of the rival Alpha. The heavy scent of winter frost spiked momentarily in the car, an uncontrollable protective reflex. He targets the vulnerable because he lacks true strength. He will never come near you again. In fact, after tonight, no Alpha in this city will dare to even breathe in your direction. You have my word. The absolute certainty in his voice melted away the last lingering shards of my anxiety. By the time the limousine pulled into the private underground parking of the Vance Tower, a profound sense of exhaustion had finally caught up with me, completely masking the deeper, biological shift that was beginning to take root in my body. We took the VIP elevator up to the penthouse. The moment the silver doors slid open, revealing the massive, silent apartment, a strange, powerful sensation washed over me. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pain. It was an overwhelming, instinctual urge. I need to make a few calls, Silas said, walking toward the sleek kitchen island to pour himself a glass of water. Marcus is finalizing the asset freeze on the Hayes estate, and I need to ensure the PR department is handling the narrative from the gala correctly. Go to the bedroom, Julian. Take a warm shower. Get some rest. I won't be long. I nodded numbly, watching him walk toward his expansive home office. The moment the heavy glass door closed behind him, the strange urge in my chest magnified 100-fold. My prime omega biology, finally free from the lumina, 9 poison and heavily stimulated by Silas's scent marking, was asserting itself with terrifying force. I felt incredibly exposed in the massive, open-concept living room. I needed to be surrounded by safety. I needed to be surrounded by him. I walked down the dark hallway and pushed open the door to Silas's bedroom. The air was thick with his natural scent, crushed cedar and winter frost. I took a deep, shuddering breath, my eyes fluttering shut as the aroma instantly soothed my frayed nerves. But it wasn't enough. My skin felt overly sensitive, and a dull, heavy ache was beginning to pool in my lower abdomen. Without entirely understanding what I was doing, I walked past the massive king-sized bed and straight into Silas's expansive walk-in closet. The space was perfectly organized, rows of expensive bespoke suits, crisp shirts, and heavy winter coats lined up with military precision. My hands moved almost entirely on their own. I reached out and pulled a thick, charcoal gray cashmere sweater off its hanger. I buried my face in the soft fabric. It smelled intensely, purely of Silas. A soft, involuntary whine escaped my throat, vibrating in the quiet closet. I needed more. Acting completely on primal instinct, I began pulling items off the hangers. Sweaters, soft cotton t-shirts, a heavy wool blanket from the top shelf. I gathered an armful of Silas's clothes, my heart beating in a frantic, driven rhythm. I carried the heavy pile out to the bedroom and dropped it onto the mattress. I didn't just leave them there. I climbed onto the bed and began to arrange them. I pushed the expensive velvet pillows to the edges, creating a circular, fortified barrier. I layered the softest, most worn-in shirts in the center, weaving the heavier sweaters and the wool blanket into the outer rim. It was a frantic, meticulous process. I smoothed out wrinkles, burying my nose into the fabrics to ensure the scent of cedar and frost was perfectly distributed. I was building a nest. In the Omegaverse, nesting is a deeply intimate, instinctual behavior triggered by extreme stress, pregnancy, or the approach of a high-grade heat. It is an Omega's way of creating an impregnable fortress of scent and comfort. And for an unbonded Omega to build a nest exclusively out of an Alpha's clothing, it was the ultimate biological confession of absolute trust, submission, and choice. I was so entirely lost in the trance-like state of arranging a dark blue silk shirt that I didn't even hear the heavy oak door of the bedroom open. "Julian," I gasped, freezing in place. Silas stood in the doorway, his phone still gripped tightly in his hand. He had rolled up his sleeves, revealing thick, muscular forearms, and his tie was completely gone. He stared at the bed, his steely gray eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated shock. The spell instantly broke. Rational thought violently crashed back into my brain. I suddenly realized what I was doing. I was sitting in the middle of the billionaire CEO's bed, having completely ruined his pristine, incredibly expensive wardrobe to build a messy pile of clothes like a deranged animal. A wave of intense, burning humiliation washed over me. The heat in my cheeks was excruciating. I'm so sorry," I stammered, frantically scrambling backward, tangling my legs in the cashmere sweaters. "I don't know what happened. I just walked into the closet, and I couldn't stop. The instinct was too strong. I'm sorry. I'll clean it up right now. I'll pay for the dry cleaning, I promise." I reached out with trembling hands to grab the clothes, desperate to undo the embarrassing display of my volatile biology. Stop. Silas's voice wasn't a roar of anger. It was a breathless, awestruck whisper. He dropped his phone onto the carpeted floor, not even caring as the expensive device bounced. He crossed the large room in 3 long, predatory strides. He didn't look angry. He looked completely, utterly captivated. He stopped at the very edge of the bed, his dark eyes tracing the circular shape of the nest, noting every single piece of his clothing that I had specifically chosen to surround myself with. "You built a nest," Silas murmured, his voice dropping into a primal, vibrating timbre that rattled my ribs. "With my clothes. With my scent. I didn't mean to cross a line," I whispered, pulling my knees tightly to my chest, my face burning with shame as I looked away from him. "I'm a prime, but I don't know how to control it. For 10 years, my body was chemically paralyzed. Now that the Lumina 9 is gone, the instincts are just taking over. I feel like I'm losing my mind." Silas slowly sank to his knees at the edge of the mattress, bringing his towering frame down to my eye level. The sheer dominance he naturally exuded softened into something incredibly tender, dangerous, and overwhelmingly vulnerable. "Julian, look at me," Silas commanded gently. I slowly lifted my head, meeting his intense gaze. The pitch-black darkness of his alpha instincts had fully eclipsed the steely gray in his irises. "Do you have any idea what this means?" Silas asked, his voice thick with emotion. He slowly reached out, his large hand gently resting on the edge of the nest, treating the pile of ruined designer clothes as if it were a sacred artifact. "An Omega only nests with the scent of an Alpha they trust implicitly. An Alpha they have chosen as their protector. As their mate." My breath caught in my throat. "Silas, I spent my entire adult life despising the idea of a mate," Silas confessed, his thumb lightly stroking the fabric of a gray sweater. "I watched my parents destroy each other over biological compatibility. I built a corporate empire to prove that I didn't need anyone, that logic and ruthlessness were the only things that mattered in this world. When my grandmother forced this marriage to clear your family's debt, I fully intended to ignore your existence for a year, file for divorce, and discard you without a second thought." He slowly moved his hand from the clothes, reaching out to gently cup my cheek. His palm was incredibly warm, his touch sending a cascade of sparks through my hypersensitive nerve endings. "But then you stood in my kitchen," Silas whispered, leaning in closer, his heavy scent wrapping around me like a warm, protective blanket. "You looked at me with those defiant, unbroken eyes. You told me you didn't want my money. And then your scent hit me. It shattered every defense I had built in a fraction of a second. I didn't save you from that fever just to avoid a PR scandal, Julian. I saved you because the thought of you dying physically tore my heart out of my chest." Tears blurred my vision. The cold, untouchable billionaire, the S-rank alpha who terrorized boardrooms, was kneeling in front of me, entirely baring his soul. "I don't want a ghost for a husband," Silas said, his voice cracking with raw honesty. "I want you. I want your defiance. I want your prime scent driving me insane every single day. I want to spend the rest of my life protecting you from anyone who ever made you feel like you were defective. But I need to know, is this just your biology reacting to safety, or is this you?" He was giving me a choice. Despite the legally binding contract, despite the immense power imbalance, despite the prime instincts screaming in my blood, Silas was demanding my conscious consent. He wanted my heart, not just my biology. I leaned my face into his large palm, closing my eyes as a tear slipped down my cheek, hitting his thumb. "It's me," I whispered, the truth ringing with absolute, undeniable clarity in my heart. "My biology brought me to your closet, Silas. But my heart wants to stay in your arms." Silas let out a ragged, trembling exhale. The ironclad restraint he had been fiercely maintaining for the past 2 days finally, spectacularly snapped. He moved with terrifying, predatory speed. He surged upward, climbing onto the mattress and directly into the center of the nest. Before I could even gasp, his strong arms wrapped around my waist, pulling me forcefully against his solid chest. His lips crashed down onto mine. It wasn't a gentle, testing kiss. It was a desperate, consuming collision of 2 souls who had finally stopped fighting their undeniable fate. Silas kissed me like I was oxygen, and he had been drowning his entire life. His mouth was incredibly hot, demanding, and entirely possessive. I let out a soft, muffled sound of complete surrender, my hands immediately flying up to fist in the soft hair at the nape of his neck. He groaned at the contact, his tongue sweeping past my parted lips, deepening the kiss until my head spun and dark spots danced behind my closed eyes. He tasted like expensive scotch, winter frost, and pure, intoxicating desire. My prime biology completely short-circuited. I melted against him, my body completely pliant, desperately arching closer to the intense heat radiating from his skin. Silas's hands roamed over my back, gripping my waist with a bruising, desperate strength before slowly sliding down to grip my hips, pulling me firmly into his lap. The friction sent a sudden, agonizingly sharp spike of heat straight through my lower abdomen. It wasn't the dull, sickening ache of the poison-induced fever. This was a blinding, molten wave of pure biological fire. My scent violently exploded in the room, the aroma of night jasmine and honeyed petrichor becoming so thick it was almost suffocating. I broke the kiss, gasping desperately for air, my entire body violently trembling. "Silas," I whimpered, clutching his broad shoulders as a second, heavier wave of liquid heat crashed through my veins. The room started to spin dangerously. Silas froze, his chest heaving as he stared down at me. His pitch-black eyes widened as he registered the sudden, astronomical spike in my temperature and the overwhelming sweetness of my scent. The Lumina, 9 poison was fully gone. My body was safe, secure in a nest, and held securely in the arms of my chosen alpha. The perfect biological conditions had been met. "Julian," Silas breathed out, his voice a dark, feral rumble of pure alpha instinct as he realized exactly what was happening. "Your heat. Your first true prime heat. It's starting right now." End of Part 6. Part 7. The Bonding Bite. The fire that ignited in my veins was nothing like the agonizing, chemical-induced fever from 2 days ago. That had been a sickness. This was an awakening. A blinding, molten wave of pure biological heat crashed through my system, so intense that my vision temporarily whited out. I gasped, arching my back off the mattress as my hands instinctively dug into Silas's broad shoulders. My prime scent, night jasmine and honeyed petrichor, exploded into the room with the force of a detonated bomb. The aroma was so thick, so devastatingly sweet, that the air in the bedroom physically shimmered with it. "Julian," Silas growled, the sound entirely stripped of his usual civilized restraint. It was the feral, possessive rumble of an S-rank alpha completely consumed by his mate's heat. Silas's arms tightened around me, his massive frame acting as the only anchor keeping me from floating away into the delirious haze. He pulled me flush against his chest, his heart hammering against my ribs like a war drum. Without a second of hesitation, Silas unleashed the full, unsuppressed weight of his own pheromones. A torrential blizzard of crushed cedar and sharp winter frost slammed into the overwhelming sweetness of my jasmine. The clash of our auras was astronomical, yet perfectly complementary. The icy dominant nature of his S-rank scent rushed into my lungs, acting as a biological coolant that instantly soothed the most terrifying spikes of my fever. "It's too much," I whimpered, my head thrashing against his shoulder. My skin felt overly sensitive, every brush of the cashmere sweaters in the nest sending jolts of electricity through my nerve endings. "Silas, please. I don't know what to do. It burns." "Look at me," Silas commanded, his voice a low, vibrating anchor in the storm. He gently but firmly grabbed my jaw, forcing my frantic gaze to meet his. His eyes were completely black, the irises swallowed entirely by his dilated pupils. But there was no madness in them. There was only absolute, fiercely protective focus. He wasn't losing control. He was harnessing every ounce of his immense power to guide me safely through the storm. "You are a prime, Julian," Silas murmured, his thumb stroking my flushed cheek, the rough texture of his skin sending a fresh wave of heat pooling in my lower abdomen. "Your body has been starved of this for 10 years. It's going to be intense. It's going to demand everything from you. But you are not alone. I am right here. I am not going anywhere." He leaned down and captured my lips again. This time, the kiss wasn't just a confession, it was a lifeline. He drank in my panicked breaths, sharing his oxygen, his tongue sweeping into my mouth to claim every inch of my senses. I clung to him desperately, my hands fisting in his dark hair, whimpering softly into his mouth as my body practically vibrated with need. An unbonded Omega experiencing a prime heat could literally die from the biological stress. The body demands a physical and chemical grounding that only an alpha can provide. My instincts were screaming at me, tearing down every logical thought I had left, reducing my entire existence to a single, overriding imperative. Bond. I broke the kiss, gasping for air. Driven by an ancient, undeniable instinct that had finally woken up in my blood, I tilted my head back. I bared my neck to him completely, exposing the rapidly pulsing, hypersensitive scent gland located just beneath my ear. "Mark me," I pleaded, the words tearing out of my throat in a breathless, desperate sob. Silas, please. Claim me. Silas went absolutely rigid. The heavy muscles in his arms locked like steel coils around my waist. He stared down at my exposed neck, his chest heaving as his own breathing turned ragged. A bonding bite, the permanent mating mark, was irreversible. It wasn't just a physical scar. It was a biological tether that permanently fused two souls together. Once bitten, my scent would forever carry an undertone of his, and his would carry mine. Julian, Silas rasped, his voice trembling with the sheer force of his restraint. He buried his face into the crook of my neck, his hot breath ghosting over the throbbing gland, sending a violent shiver down my spine. Are you absolutely certain? The Lumina, 9 is gone, but your heat is speaking for you right now. If I bite you, there is no going back. You will be mine until the day I die. I am certain, I cried out, my hands urgently pressing against the back of his head, trying to pull him closer. The ache in my body was becoming unbearable. I don't want anyone else. I want your mark. I want you. Please, Silas. The last thread of his iron restraint violently snapped. With a deep, guttural growl that rattled my very bones, Silas opened his mouth and pressed his lips firmly against the soft, flushed skin of my scent gland. He didn't hesitate. I felt the sharp, terrifying pressure of his elongated alpha canines pressing against my pulse point. And then he bit down. A sharp, piercing cry tore from my lips as his teeth broke the skin, sinking deep into the gland. For a fraction of a second, there was a blinding flash of sharp pain, but it was instantaneously entirely eclipsed by what followed. The moment his teeth locked into place, Silas released a massive, concentrated surge of his pheromones directly into my bloodstream. It was like being struck by lightning. A tidal wave of pure, unadulterated euphoria violently exploded in my brain. The agonizing, burning fever of my heat was instantly extinguished, replaced by a profound, earth-shattering sense of completeness. Endorphins flooded my system in overwhelming quantities, turning my muscles to liquid gold. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could feel was him. Through the biological tether of the bite, I could suddenly feel Silas's emotions as if they were my own. I felt his overwhelming protective rage, his deep-seated fear of losing me, and beneath it all, a dark, consuming, terrifyingly beautiful love that he had never shown to another living soul. My hands went slack, dropping from his hair to loosely grip his broad shoulders. I melted completely against his body, tears of pure, overwhelming relief streaming down my face. My prime scent shifted instantly. The raw night jasmine intertwined seamlessly with the sharp winter frost, creating a new, breathtaking aroma that belonged entirely to us. We were no longer two separate entities fighting a contract. We were one. Silas held the bite for a long, heavy minute, ensuring the bond was permanently established. When he finally, slowly pulled his teeth from my neck, he immediately replaced the sharp pain with the soothing, gentle stroke of his tongue, licking over the fresh puncture wounds to seal them with his saliva. Mine, Silas whispered fiercely against my marked skin, his voice thick and raw. My Omega. My Julian. Yours. I breathed back, my eyes fluttering shut as a deep, intoxicating lethargy began to pull me under. The heat didn't end with the bite, but the agony was gone. What followed was a complete surrender to our instincts. The next few days completely dissolved into a timeless, isolated haze. The world outside the penthouse ceased to exist. Silas didn't answer his phone. He didn't leave the bedroom. He kept me securely wrapped in the center of the nest we had built, providing exactly what my prime biology demanded. When the fever spiked, he cooled me with his pheromones. When I was weak, he coaxed me to drink water and eat the small meals the chef left outside our locked door. He was incredibly demanding, intensely possessive, but devastatingly gentle. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered promise of protection in the dark solidified the profound bond we had forged. The ruthless billionaire who had drafted a post-nuptial agreement demanding a divorce in a year was completely gone, replaced by a fiercely devoted mate who treated me like the most precious thing in his empire. When the fever finally broke completely, bringing an end to the intense cycle of my heat, I woke up to the soft, golden light of the morning sun filtering through the heavy curtains. I was lying on my stomach, tangled in the ruined cashmere sweaters of my nest. I felt incredibly exhausted, every muscle in my body aching with a deep, heavy fatigue, but my mind was clearer than it had been in a decade. I slowly turned my head. Silas was awake, lying on his side next to me. He was propped up on one elbow, his dark eyes tracing the lines of my face with a soft, reverent expression. The permanent, angry red scar of the mating bite was proudly displayed on my neck, completely uncovered. Seeing I was awake, Silas reached out, his long fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair from my forehead. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice a low, soothing rumble that sent a familiar, comforting shiver down my spine. "Like I was hit by a truck," I admitted with a raspy chuckle, leaning my cheek into the warmth of his palm. "But good. I feel safe." Silas's eyes darkened slightly with intense emotion. He leaned in and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to my lips. "You are safe. You will never be anything but safe with me, Julian." I smiled, my heart swelling with a love so profound it practically ached. I shifted my weight, intending to pull myself closer to him, to bury my face in his chest and fall back asleep. But as I moved, a strange, sudden sensation rippled through my lower abdomen. It wasn't pain. It wasn't the lingering ache of the heat. It was a profound, deep biological shift. A flutter of warmth, incredibly faint but undeniably present, settling low in my core. A strange wave of nausea suddenly washed over me, accompanied by an intense, inexplicable craving for something sweet. I froze, my hand instinctively flying to rest flat against my stomach. Silas noticed the sudden change in my posture immediately. The relaxed, post-heat alpha instantly vanished, replaced by high alert. He sat up slightly, his brow furrowing in concern. "Julian, what's wrong? Are you in pain?" Silas asked, his hand hovering over my shoulder, ready to call for the doctor. I stared down at my own hand resting on my flat stomach. My prime biology, completely unsuppressed and violently awakened by an S-rank alpha during a completely unprotected, days-long heat cycle. The math was terrifyingly simple, yet entirely incomprehensible to my mind. I slowly looked up to meet Silas's worried gray eyes, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs for an entirely new reason. The world seemed to stop spinning for a fraction of a second. "Silas," I whispered, my voice trembling as the sheer gravity of the situation finally crashed into me. I think we need to call the doctor." End of Part 7. Part 8, The Ultimate Claim. "I think we need to call the doctor." The words hung in the quiet, sunlit bedroom like a suspended drop of water before a storm. For a terrifying, breathless second, Silas didn't move. His steely gray eyes, usually so calculating and composed, were wide with a mixture of confusion and absolute, unfiltered panic. "Doctor," Silas repeated, the words stumbling out of his mouth. The ruthless billionaire who commanded boardrooms and destroyed conglomerates in his sleep looked completely paralyzed. He stared at my hand, which was still resting protectively over my flat stomach. "Julian, are you saying?" "I don't know," I whispered, a nervous tear slipping down my cheek. "I just feel different. There's a shift. My biology, it feels like it's rearranging itself. And the nausea." Silas didn't ask another question. The paralysis instantly vanished, replaced by the terrifyingly efficient, commanding alpha I knew so well. He lunged across the mattress, grabbing his phone from the nightstand. He dialed a number, not bothering to put on a shirt or even step out of the nest we had built. "Dr. Eris. My penthouse." "Now," Silas barked into the receiver, his voice leaving absolutely no room for debate. "Bring a full diagnostic kit and a portable ultrasound machine. If you aren't here in 10 minutes, you're fired." He hung up, tossing the phone aside before turning his full attention back to me. He gently pulled me into his chest, wrapping his strong arms securely around my waist. His heavy, winter frost pheromones spiked, blanketing the room in a thick, protective layer meant to soothe my escalating anxiety. "Breathe, Julian," Silas murmured, pressing his lips to my temple. His own heart was hammering against my cheek like a frantic drum. "Whatever it is, you are safe. I am right here." The next 15 minutes were the longest of my entire life. When Dr. Eris, the Vance family's elite private physician, rushed into the bedroom looking entirely out of breath, Silas barely gave him room to set up his equipment. The alpha practically hovered over the bed, his dark eyes tracking the doctor's every move with lethal intensity. "Mr. Vance, I need a little space to examine him," Dr. Eris requested politely, though he was clearly intimidated by Silas's overbearing presence. "You have all the space you need." "Do your job," Silas growled, refusing to let go of my hand. Dr. Eris sighed, deciding not to argue with a heavily marked Prime's freshly bonded mate. He quickly drew a vial of my blood, running it through a portable, high-tech centrifuge analyzer he had brought in his medical case. The machine hummed quietly, a stark contrast to the deafening silence in the room. I squeezed Silas's hand tightly, my knuckles turning white. What if I was wrong? What if the Lumina 9 had done permanent damage, and my body was just reacting to the trauma of the heat. A sharp beep from the machine made us all flinch. Dr. Eris looked at the digital readout. His eyes widened slightly behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He looked up at Silas, then down at me, a soft, genuine smile breaking across his professional demeanor. "Well, the blood test is definitive," Dr. Eris said, turning to open his portable ultrasound monitor. "But let's take a look to be absolutely certain." He gently lifted the hem of my oversized t-shirt, applying a dollop of cold, clear gel to my lower abdomen. I shivered, but Silas's warm thumb instinctively rubbed the back of my hand, grounding me. Dr. Eris pressed the wand against my skin, moving it slowly across my stomach. We all stared at the small, glowing screen. For a few agonizing seconds, there was nothing but static and gray shadows. But then, the doctor stopped moving the wand. He zoomed in on a tiny, almost imperceptible dark circle. He pressed a button on the console, and suddenly, a sound filled the silent bedroom. Thump-thump, thump-thump, thump-thump. It was incredibly fast, like the rapid beating of a tiny bird's wings. It was the most beautiful, terrifying, awe-inspiring sound I had ever heard in my entire life. "Congratulations, Mr. Vance," Dr. Eris said softly. "Your mate is pregnant." Given the intensity of a prime's first unsuppressed heat, the conception occurred almost immediately. It's very early, but the heartbeat is remarkably strong. I stopped breathing. The tears I had been holding back completely broke free, streaming down my face. I was pregnant. A tiny new life, created from a bond born out of chaos and contract, was growing inside of me. I turned my head to look at Silas. The most feared man in the city, the S-rank alpha who despised omegas and swore he would never let biology dictate his life, had completely shattered. Silas was staring at the monitor, his jaw trembling. Slowly, he lowered himself until he was kneeling on the floor beside the bed. He brought my hand to his lips, burying his face against my knuckles. When he finally looked up at me, his steely gray eyes were completely glassy with unshed tears. "A baby," Silas whispered, his voice cracking with a depth of emotion I didn't know he possessed. "Julian, we're going to have a baby. You aren't mad?" I asked through my own tears, my insecurities momentarily flaring. "The contract, you said you didn't want your life derailed." Silas let out a wet, breathless laugh. He reached up, his large hand gently resting over the spot on my stomach where the doctor had placed the wand. "Burn the contract, Julian," Silas said fiercely, his thumb lightly caressing my skin. "My life didn't even begin until you walked into it. You, and this baby, you are my empire now. I will give you the world." 6 months later. "Silas, if you don't stop hovering, I am going to physically throw you out the window." I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in our newly renovated bedroom, struggling to button the suit jacket over my significantly swollen belly. I was 6 months pregnant, and my prime biology was fiercely nurturing the growing alpha pup inside me. I felt heavy, exhausted, and incredibly hormonal. Silas, who was standing a mere 2 feet behind me, immediately stepped forward, his large hands gently swatting mine away to expertly manipulate the buttons for me. "I am not hovering," Silas stated calmly, his deep voice vibrating pleasantly against my back. "I am merely ensuring my heavily pregnant, highly desirable prime mate doesn't trip on a rug." I rolled my eyes, though a fond smile tugged at the corners of my lips. Ever since the day we discovered the pregnancy, Silas had transformed into a completely ridiculous, overprotective shadow. He had moved his entire corporate headquarters into the penthouse, just so he wouldn't have to leave my side. He vetted everything I ate, monitored my sleep schedule, and practically growled at anyone who looked at me for longer than 3 seconds. "I am perfectly capable of walking to the living room, Silas," I teased, leaning back into his solid chest. His arms immediately wrapped securely around my waist, his large palms resting possessively over my baby bump. The baby kicked hard against his hand, as if greeting its alpha father. Silas's eyes softened instantly, a low, rumbling purr vibrating in his chest that completely melted my heart. "Besides," I continued, turning slightly in his arms to look up at him, "there is no one left to threaten us. You made sure of that." It was the undeniable truth. Following our mating and the announcement of my pregnancy, Silas had unleashed absolute hell upon our enemies. Protocol Zero had been flawlessly executed. My parents, the people who had poisoned me and sold me like a piece of property, were completely ruined. Silas had exposed their illegal gambling debts, frozen their accounts, and handed all the evidence of their Lumina 9 purchases over to the authorities. They were currently serving long prison sentences for child endangerment and black market trafficking. They would never hurt anyone ever again. As for Damien Croft, the rival alpha had learned exactly why you don't insult Silas Vance. Silas had ruthlessly dismantled the Croft conglomerate in a series of aggressive corporate takeovers, leaving Damien's family bankrupt and entirely disgraced in high society. The golden cage of this penthouse was no longer a prison. It was a fortress, heavily guarded and filled with absolute love. I would burn the city to ashes 10 times over to ensure you and our child never know a single day of fear, Silas murmured, leaning down to press a soft kiss against the permanent mating mark on my neck. The contact sent a familiar, thrilling shiver down my spine. I know, I whispered, turning fully to wrap my arms around his neck. Silas looked down at me, his steely gray eyes filled with a profound, terrifyingly beautiful adoration. The cold, ruthless billionaire who had tossed a post-nuptial agreement at me in the back of a limousine was completely gone. In his place stood my fiercely devoted mate, the father of my child, and the absolute love of my life. Remember rule number 4? I asked playfully, a mischievous glint in my eye. In exactly 365 days, we file for a quiet, uncontested divorce. Silas scoffed, a deep, genuine laugh escaping his chest. He scooped me up into his arms effortlessly, making me squeak in surprise. The only thing I'm filing today is a request for the chef to make those strawberry pastries you were craving at 3 in the morning, Silas declared, carrying me out of the bedroom and toward the sunlit living room. I rested my head against his broad shoulder, closing my eyes as his comforting scent of crushed cedar and winter frost wrapped around me, perfectly intertwining with my own sweet night jasmine. I had been born into a sinking ship. I had been poisoned, sold, and forced to marry a monster. But as I listened to the steady, strong heartbeat of the man holding me, and felt the tiny flutter of our baby kicking in my stomach, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Sometimes, the monster you fear the most is exactly the protector you need to find your happily ever after. End of story. Wow, what an incredible journey. Take a deep breath with me, everyone, because Julian and Silas's story was an absolute roller coaster of emotions from start to finish. When we first met these two, their relationship was literally bound by cold, hard ink, a forced business transaction. Silas was the ultimate untouchable CEO, an alpha who viewed omegas as nothing more than biological inconveniences and manipulative liabilities. And Julian was just trying to survive. He was completely numb to the world, convinced he was a defective, broken pawn in his parents' toxic games. But what makes this story so incredibly powerful is how they accidentally saved each other. Julian wasn't broken. He was actively suppressed and poisoned by the very people who were supposed to protect him. His parents literally caged his true prime nature just to use him as a casino chip. The moment Silas discovered the truth about the Lumina 9, the entire dynamic shifted. We saw the ruthless, ice-cold billionaire instantly transform into an absolute shield. I think the most beautiful turning point in the entire story has to be the nesting scene. In the Omegaverse, nesting is instinctual, but for Julian, building that nest out of Silas's clothes was his first real act of agency and trust. He was subconsciously choosing Silas. And Silas, despite all his immense power and alpha dominance, actually dropped to his knees. He didn't force Julian, he asked for his conscious consent. It proved that underneath all that terrifying winter frost, Silas was exactly the safe haven Julian always desperately needed. And can we take a moment to talk about that revenge? Protocol Zero was absolutely satisfying. Silas didn't just protect Julian in the heat of the moment. He completely obliterated the toxic family and the arrogant rivals, like Damien Croft, who dared to look at his mate the wrong way. He burned their traumatic pasts to the ground so they could build a beautiful future. Ending with the pregnancy was the perfect full-circle moment. Two men who were forced together by a ruthless contract ended up creating a real family built purely on love, choice, and fierce protection. Silas finally found an empire actually worth ruling, and Julian finally found a home where he was allowed to beautifully bloom. What did you guys think? Which moment gave you the most butterflies? Let me know down in the comments below. I read every single one. If you loved Silas and Julian's story as much as I did, please smash that like button. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe to join the Your BL Boyfriend family. We have so many more thrilling, steamy, and romantic audio tales coming your way very soon. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your amazing support. And until next time, stay safe, stay romantic, and I'll catch you in the next story.